Good morning. This is the 16th of the Dr. Obutashaka shows. This one is special. They are all, to me, are special, but this one is going to have special importance to everyone that watches this because the topic for this one addresses the most central issue that faces Black folks in the US, and while I won't have time to discuss this today, globally. And it is the central issue. It's like the ground floor for you dealing with just about everything. Every generation has an issue that's central to them. This one is not so easy to understand from the surface. When I get through with this, I think you'll have a clearer understanding of this. And I really want to stress that if you really want to get into the depths of this, you need to read this book, Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. And this basically deals with this central issue. And I would also suggest that you look at a book written by a brother named Bakari Kitwana, The Hip Hop Generation. This is not about hip hop music. It's about the issues facing the generation of Blacks born from the late 60s on. And I found this to be excellent. I'm going to eventually have him on my show. So this topic that I'm going to be discussing today ties into everything that we have discussed so far in the Dr. Obutashaka show. And it's foundational because it is central to facing the problems that plague our communities today. And it is also central to the solution to those problems. At a later time, I'll apply this to the African world because it applies there as well. And generally, I don't repeat myself. Generally, I move from one topic to the other when I'm on the road or at any time speaking or writing. But the one thing that will keep coming up, no matter what the subject is, will be this subject that we're dealing with today. And I could have titled this topic differently, but some people wouldn't have known what it was about. But you'll see coming out of this discussion what the foundation issue is. So the topic for this morning is, why are Black families weaker today than they were 150 years ago? Why are Black families weaker today than they were 150 years ago? Now, this may sound like, oh, we're just going to have a negative discussion. No, I'm hitting the tip of the iceberg when it comes to dealing with the state of African people in America, or Black folks. And it is the tip of something much deeper. And so this is going to be the subject for today. Now, what I want to stress is what I've been doing now, going on 4 months, is I've been presenting different shows. Some of them have been interviews, some of them my own presentations. These are like chapters in a book. Each one of these shows stand on its own, but they're all related. For example, I started this show on Free the Mind, and I was giving you some background on me so that you could understand the central importance of this show, which is providing the path to mental freedom, the stages of awakening. This show is grounded on that. And I dealt with myself because I underwent this awakening. Part of my thoughts come from practice. And so by the time you're going to hear about them, they work. And so this is, of all the things we do on this show, the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which I touched on in 2 shows in preparing for African identity, is like the foundation. But that foundation operates within the context of the issues that affect Black folks today. And so addressing the issues of identity, the issues of self-love, self-respect, self-knowledge, it's within the context of being able to negotiate what you face in your families and in your communities, and wherever you are in this country or in the world. And then, we had a show on lessons from post-Reconstruction, for voting Trump out of the White House into the jailhouse. Certain themes came out of that show that focuses on our culture and shows why we demonstrated the strengths that we did that I covered in the last show on how we led the move to vote Trump out of the White House. So all of these are interconnected, but you're going to see culture is really at the foundation of all of them. And then the awakening process, the same thing with the show, The Spiritual Blues, which is, I think, one of the two best shows, The Spiritual Blues and Lessons from Post-Reconstruction for voting Trump out of the White House and the jailhouse, which has now been renamed Black Power and something else. But if you go and look at it, it starts with the topic of Black Power. All of them are showing you how everything stands on your culture, both African and especially this new African and African American that we have generally neglected. So the topic for today is like a signature topic for me. If you listen to Brother Malcolm X in the 60s, you will note that he had certain central themes, one of which was the house Negro and the field Negro. That was his theme, and it was kind of addressing his way of looking at the Black freedom movement. King had his own issues that he raised constantly in his addresses. Every people in a particular generation have certain issues that are central to them, and they define really how they view the issues of their generation. And so this topic for today is a topic that bridges two generations, those born before the 60s and those born after. That's everybody. But it's the central issue that affects those born after 1960, 68, and it affects all of us and befuddles many, particularly older Blacks, because things have changed in the Black community and in the African world. So the topic I'm dealing with today, why are Black families weaker today than 150 years ago, is really based on central issue, the signature definition of both the problem and the solution for what we face today. So the question is, why are Black families weaker today than 150 years ago? In African American culture and African culture, the two most important principles are family and spirit. Family and spirit. And so when we address the issue of family, we are addressing the issue of the culture, because it's the family that transmits the culture. In fact, it's the very nature of the family that defines a culture. If your family systems are just, then the likelihood is your culture will be just, because it's the foundation for your culture, which is no more than saying, if the relationship between men and women is balanced, is just, then you're going to find that society will be. Now, we've come up under oppression, so we know that we have to cut through a whole lot to get through to good relationships. But generally, when we do, we're drawing from our culture. So family and spirit, central to this culture, to African culture. Another way to put it is in an age in which a majority of Black families are led by Black women, your mama and God. Or to put it another way, when a basketball player slam dunks or a team wins a game, they attribute it to two things. What is it? God and my mama. And the average Black person who's able to get a little bit of wherewithal, the first thing they do is make sure that mama has a house. I remember with the 49ers, Neon Dion, people made fun of him. You know what I mean? He was a great defensive football player. But his mother, in defending him, she said, he's great because he didn't just buy me a house. You got to see this mansion he bought me. My computer person, brother named Cinnabar, just got through buying his mother a house, and he ain't rich. You know what I mean? But see, family is central. And in this age where the majority of family is headed by the woman, she's playing both mother and father. And so that's central to our lives. If you look at LeBron James and he talks about his mama, it's with a big smile. And you can see she did a pretty good job because that's a good brother there. But this is central to our culture, family. Now, when I asked the question, why are Black families weaker today than 150 years ago? I'm really asking a bigger question. And that bigger question is, why are the generations of Blacks born after 1968, why are their conditions fundamentally different from the conditions and the situation of Blacks born before that, in my generation? Though many things are the same, there are some things that are fundamentally different. So the pre-1968 generation of Blacks and the post-1968 generation of Blacks will be able to forge some kind of intergenerational unity at a higher level, much better, when we understand both what the generation since 68 has in common in terms of situations that they live under with the generation born before. And when we have a better understanding of this, we will have a stronger foundation for intergenerational unity. So this is a key question that we'll be answering, at least to some degree, in this discussion today. Now, one of the biggest divides between the post-68 generation or post-60s generation of Blacks and the generation earlier is what I call a situational divide. In other words, one of the reasons why the youth today, or people younger, people born after 1960 or 1968, find themselves in such a different set of circumstances, yet the same. They face racism just as all generations of Blacks have faced racism. And they face many other things that all generations of Blacks have faced. But they also face some changing situations. And these changing situations are not often understood by the older generation, particularly understanding how it impacts a people, a generation of Blacks born under these changed circumstances. So what I want to share with you is based on that. But I also want to share with you the fact that the basis for the analysis I'm presenting, which is one of the most important analyses that I present, is one that comes from the second source of my insights. I told you the first source is practice. So a lot of my thought is based on practice. So it's field tested and it generally tends to work. Been doing this 61 years as an organizer, 58 as a scholar, and I've undergone transformation. So what I've learned from practice guides a good part of my scholarship and my leadership. But my best stuff comes from piping in to the higher source, piping into God's mind. I know this plays with a lot of people. I've been told when I tell people this, a lot of people aren't going to believe it. And all I have to say is, I have no reason to lie because, first of all, I don't lie. But secondly, the human ego would always like to say, I got this on my own, you know? So I'd like to be able to say that this analysis that I'm presenting came from me. I'm so smart. I figured all this out on my own. But actually, just as my practice is a basis for my thought, which means I learn from a lot of people. So there are circumstances in your life where you don't have answers. And for me, because I'm a spirit scholar warrior, my questions are about things bigger than myself. I'm concerned about my people. And so some of these are big questions, and sometimes you just don't have the answer. And so what I want to share with you is where this is coming from, this analysis, because it's not a theory. A theory is a guess. A theory's got something right and something wrong. And that's basically how white culture works. It's a theory, it's a guess. I don't do that. But even my practice, which makes things works for me, sometimes the practice alone just doesn't give the answer. And especially when you're facing new circumstances. So this thing that I say is an analysis that is good for both generations and defines the fundamental issue facing this generation arises for me, the answer arises from me from interaction with my students. And this occurred in the early 80s. And I was teaching a class on Black politics. A young lady, she looked like she was around 18 years old, a young sister, asked me a very simple question. She said, if our culture is so strong, why are we seeing so many contradictions in it? Why is there so much erosion of it? And I gave her an answer. And then I went home and I realized I didn't know. And usually when you don't know, you just say you don't know, but I didn't know because it seemed to be a simple question. But when I went home, I realized I didn't have the answer. I went back to class 2 days later and apologized and said that I didn't have the answer to this. I'm sorry I gave the wrong answer. I don't remember what the answer was, you know. I just know I didn't know. One night I'm living in Richmond, California, and I live in Oakland, and I'm watching TV and James Baldwin comes on. Baldwin was one of our best thinkers. And Baldwin said, since the late 60s, powerful forces have hit the Black community, the likes of which the Black community was not prepared for. And when Baldwin made that comment, it clicked. It gave me half the answer for the question this student was asking. But I still didn't have the full answer. What's going on in our community that's disrupting our culture? It's still there, but there's holes in it. What's happening? So one night I'm sitting in my study, and always when I have these experiences, I'm in a state of humility. Really, it's a state of ignorance. And I know I don't know. And I'm asking for help. And I don't, whenever I've had this experience, I don't expect to receive help. And so I ask, what happened? And the reason that I really couldn't provide an answer for this student, I realize now, even when I got the answer, I didn't fully realize it is, changes had been going on in the Black community and in this society that has had an impact on our youth. And I had not really understood how those changes had impacted our youth. And so when I asked the question, what happened? I've said this before when I first opened this show and a few other times. When I pipe into God's mind, some people it's through dreams or intuition or whatever, I see a light. And I said to you before, God's a great light, great white light. I know, don't confuse this with white people. It's spirit, baby, you know? And so when I see this light, it speaks to me without talking, telepathically. And sometime down the road, you'll hear me talk about my most important writing, Return to the African Mother Principle, Male and Female Equality, that's based on a great white light. It's the answer for what's the basis for just societies. That was the most beautiful experience of my life. This light wasn't as bright because I was asking a question that was important that I didn't have the answer to, and a lot of Black people didn't have the answer to, but it wasn't as big. It was asking about what's gone wrong in Black communities, what's shifted that would cause some holes to develop, some cracks to develop in our culture that wasn't there before. And so I saw this light, beautiful light, and without talking, telepathically, it said, what happened is a choice between two cultures. A choice between two cultures. What this meant was that the forces that James Baldwin had described as powerful hostile forces that had hit Black communities had put Black communities and Black people in a position of choosing between a mad Euro-American culture and African-American or new African culture that has an African foundation. What makes this particularly difficult is that most of our people who got hit by these forces that I'm going to describe in a minute didn't understand the consequences. As I didn't understand that the forces that hit our community was putting us in a position where either we would draw from our strengths, our cultural strengths as African people and negotiate them and handle them, or could begin to take us out of our culture, not wholly. No, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. A choice between two cultures does not mean that, so some of our people have just gone completely out of their culture. No, culture is your way of life and designed for living. And as a result, it's in you. It's like the roots of a tree, you know, it's in you. But elements of it can be eroded, just as elements of African culture were eroded here, and it required us to create a new African one. So that is the problem. You know, the problem is that we often didn't understand that some of the behavior changes we started to see, some of the institutional changes we started to see in Black communities due to powerful forces that hit us was actually taking us out of our culture. Now, in certain cases, we did. Drugs, for example, that we'll get into later. It was obvious. That's taken us out of our culture. But there's a lot of other things that we didn't really either understand that they were taking us out of our culture. We certainly didn't understand it was putting us in a position of choosing. And you may say, well, what's different about that than enslavement? Well, enslavement, we were attacked as a people. Our culture was attacked, and every effort was made to destroy it. And because of the power of white power in this country, a settler colony, as opposed to the Caribbean, where Africans were in the majority, this required us to go inside ourselves, draw on the roots The fundamental principles of our culture and spirit and family are at the heart of this. And of course, on this desire for freedom, and out of this, drawing from African foundation principles, we recreated a new culture. So the difference between enslavement and what we're facing now is that enslavement, we were recreating culture. In this case, while there's always cultural recreation, because as conditions change, you have to produce changes in the culture. That happens. Cultures are not fixed. But in this case, the forces that hit us put us in a position of making choices. And when you're not conscious that that's happening, it makes you more vulnerable. Now you see behind me this yellow picture that I always refer to of Amilcar Cabral, the guy with the sunglasses on. The greatest leader, I think, greatest political thinker, greatest organizer, and best military leader in the 20th century. His casualty rate in his armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, which he led, proves that. 120 or so Guineans and Cape Verdeans lost and over 50,000 Portuguese killed. He was effective in the armed struggle, but I draw on him more because of his thought. And his thought was very perceptive. And one of the things that Cabral said was this: you measure a people's chance for achieving liberation by the qualitative difference between the culture of the oppressed and the culture of the oppressor. To the degree that the culture of the oppressed is different and generally operating on a higher ground, then to that degree do you have a chance for achieving liberation. If your culture is close to that of the oppressor, you may not even see yourself as being oppressed. There were some house slaves in enslavement who thought that their masters treated them so well that if you ask them, let's run away, they'd say, why should I run away? Where can I find a better house than this? Because they were taking on the culture of the oppressor. But not very many house slaves felt that way. Malcolm exaggerated that when he said, the house slave would say, where can I find a better house than this and all of that. A few, they always knew they were in the attic or sleeping under the stairs or in a closet. The majority of house slaves ran away with field slaves, and many of them were prepared to engage in a rebellion, though almost all the rebellions that were betrayed by house slaves, indicating that the more you think like your master, the more likely you are to want to protect them. And we do have house slaves, people with house slave mentalities today. They're calling it our country, our White House, our president. We put the president in the White House. We're going to kick his behind to get him to do what needs to be done. But do not fool yourself. Our president, look at his record. He's only doing better because you put him there. So the thing is, we have faced a set of forces that have hit us that has put us in a position of choosing between two cultures. So the real question is, how do you make the right cultural choices? That means you've got to know your culture. You've got to know the forces that have hit you. And then you're going to have to roll up your sleeves to do right. In most cases, our culture will carry us through that. But in some cases, we're going to have to be conscious of what these choices are. So when I asked, why are Black families weaker today than 150 years ago? So the Black family is really a metaphor or a symbol for the culture, and we'll be talking about the culture as a whole. And it is the transmitter of the culture, along with other institutions in the culture. Now, it's been generally assumed that slavery destroyed Black families, just as it's been generally assumed that slavery destroyed Black culture. You hear me over and over again stress how enslavement didn't destroy a culture, because the only way you destroy a people's culture is to wipe them out. As long as people exist, culture will exist. It'll undergo transformation, but it will exist. So what's also commonly assumed is our family systems were destroyed because we were not allowed to formally marry. Because in some cases, masters pick your mates, but in most cases, the literature on enslavement shows that the bonds of love were too strong for masters to get in the way of. And so in most cases, the union between male and female was chosen by those two. And there was plenty of love on the plantation. That is one of the things that kept us going. But here's the key thing to understand about the Black family that has generally been surprising to a lot of people, including scholars. My good friend, Dr. Nathan Hare, who is the first chair of Black Studies at San Francisco State, was fired from Howard University for being too Black, was a boxer also, and spent the last 7, 8, 9 years of his life until about 2 years ago taking care of his wife, Julia Hare, who suffered from Alzheimer's. And that takes a toll on you, but that's the nature of Black folks. A lot of Black folks do that. But he was the first to make this observation that the Black family maintained more unity between 1865 and 1968 than between 1968 and now. That was an observation he made on a book that he wrote on Black families. In fact, if you look at the data from 1860 to 1968, 75% of Black families were two-parent households. But between 68 and now, 28% of Black families are two-parent households. The Black family has undergone more erosion between 1968 and now than between 1865 and 1968. So something must have happened to bring about those changes, because Black people maintained two-parent households in circumstances that were hellish. The post-Reconstruction period, where the Klan was rioting, sharecropping, moving into urban areas in the North where half the time it was hard to find a job. And the jobs really opened up when there was a war. You know, some people have said Tojo, who was the head of Japan, did more to advance Blacks than anything else, because when he bombed Pearl Harbor and set America on the course of war, that opened up wartime industrial jobs, which it took a threat of a march on Washington from A. Philip Randolph to open up, because everybody had been hired to work except Blacks. Like everybody's getting COVID shots right now, except a whole lot of Blacks. And it ain't all because Black people are suspicious. Some are. Most know they need to get those shots. It's a systemic racism that is endemic to American society and to Western society, but especially American society. So the Black family faced harsh conditions of racism, conditions of poverty, and yet men and women were able to stay together. Now, I'm not going to romanticize the relationship. There are all kinds of Black families, all kinds of relationships. A whole lot of them, though, were good. But most important, they held together. And that says something about the culture, because the family is at the foundation of your culture. And if you have stability in your family, this is saying something that's really powerful about the culture. It means that you've got one hell of a culture when you haven't got a cent to pay the rent, but you're making it. Over 100 years. So the question is, What happened? What happened to shift the family from 75% two-parent households to 28% two-parent households? What happened? Now, one of the reasons that the two-parent household remained strong for over 100 years in Black communities was the extended family community. Extended family are all of your relatives, you know, that make up your extended family. But extended family community are the play brothers, the play sisters, the aunts, the uncles. It's the community that treats you like family. And we know until the 80s, the community raised our children, not just mother and father. They were the mothers and fathers. When I broke the old lady's window on Bush Street, when I was living in Fillmore Street, she whipped me and then sent me home, and I got a whipping because the elders, grandma's hands and grandpa's too, could lay on you if you weren't doing right. There's been a shift in that. So the extended family, which is an institution coming out of Africa, we couldn't carry lineage, which is the larger or clan family systems, because we weren't all related. But we could carry this extended family community. And so when families were separated in enslavement, you were reintegrated into the extended family of whatever plantation you were on. And that sustained you because it gave you love. It looked after you. And marriage, until recently in the Black community, wasn't just between two people. Families had a say-so in it. And so that also accounts for this stability. And the marriage rate among Blacks was actually higher than among whites. And yet, materially, we had a lot less to work with. But culturally, we had a whole lot more. So this is the key thing to get straight. Now, for those 100 years, our culture was transmitted through family, extended family, churches and schools, secret societies, and apprenticeship systems. John Henry Clark, who's one of the greatest scholars that we produced, John Henry Clark came out of an African-American apprenticeship system. And his master and masters were almost as important to him as his mother and father, not quite as important as his grandmother, who passed on the legacy of Africa and told him about his great-grandfather, Buck, who took no mess from the enslaver. That was John's link to Africa, because he was this brave fighting African who his grandmother constantly preached about and developed his interest in Africa. So these were transmission belts for our culture: family, extended family community, church, school, apprenticeship systems, grounded in secret societies. When you heard the discussion with Akinyele Umoja, he talked about the role of secret societies in Mississippi in forming all Black communities, building up a lot of the institutions among Black people. These are African institutions. Multi-million dollar, hundreds of millions of dollar insurance companies came out of that, for example. So those were the transmission belts of our culture. And those were African transmission belts. And another one was the institution of elderhood, because Blacks relied on wisdom when they made decisions. The group made decisions, but they would often call on the wisest among them to give their opinion. Many of the secret societies that organized after enslavement and created massive economic systems, these were often set up by younger members of the community who went to their elders to get advice on how to set them up. So these were the things that sustained the family and many other things for 100 years. So what situations occurred that changed the conditions in our community, that served to weaken the family and brought change in the Black community? What were some of these circumstances? The first one was that the hip hop generation, or the generation born after the 60s, particularly after 1968, they were born under the circumstances of the second post-Reconstruction. So it was their experience to live in a world, those born right at 68 or whatever, they could be told about the great movements of the 60s, but their immediate experience is all the moves that are being made to take back the gains of the 60s. That was the second post-Reconstruction. The first one was 1876, Hayes-Tilden Compromise. So the second one occurs in 1968 with the election of Tricky Dick, or Richard Milhouse Nixon. And so you see the Supreme Court being stacked with conservatives, and they're moving against the gains of the 60s. That is still going on. So the younger generation has grown up in this context. Now, what are the powerful forces that hit our community? And the key thing to get straight is that the choice between two cultures, the choice between a Euro-American or an African-American culture, is often played out in Black communities through generations. And so we see the greatest differences in cultures being manifested between, or expressed between, the young and the old, those born after the 1960s and those born before. And the main reason is that this younger generation has been hit and in fact been raised up under circumstances in which certain powerful external forces have had a more direct influence on their life than their elders. It's affected their elders too, but this has been their environment, whereas the elders have had some other environments to draw from that served as the transmission belts for this great culture. Often ignored, in African philosophy, there's a principle that we often miss in European cultures because we're taught to think individually. And so we always look at people's behavior and base our conclusions on how we respond as individuals. Someone takes drugs, well, it's their responsibility. They didn't have to do it. So Nancy Reagan's can come up with a slogan, of choose not to take drugs. Well, that's a good point. We all have choices. But African philosophy teaches you the greatest force in life is a force of organization and countering it, disorganization. And so whenever you have a situation where society is highly organized in a positive way, you're going to see better outcomes coming with people's behavior. And when you have a lot of disorganization in a society, you're going to see more negative outcomes. The best example, and it's one that's not a pretty one, is rape. A lot of sisters and a lot of women have experienced sexual abuse. That's disorganization. And of course, it's coming from a deranged set of behaviors. But if you've experienced that, then that's going to upset your equilibrium, your balance in life. You can overcome it, but chances are you're going to need help to overcome that. And so when powerful hostile forces hit your community, they are disorganizing forces. And in this case, causing choices between two cultures. So this one that I'm going to start with, we often don't identify. Some of us, it's just simply an employer. It's either can you get a job with this group or not. And if you are, you're satisfied. And if you aren't, unless you can set up a business or get a job with state or local government, you're in trouble. But this external force is combined with one other, one of the three biggest forces that hit our people in the post-1968 reality. And this is the force of globalization. And generally, our culture understands racism. Very often, we're not even looking for this thing called globalization. And what is this? This is the merger of corporations into bigger and bigger entities, to the point where the globalized community run by corporations, you find that these corporations have more power than many nations combined. And the generation born after the 60s is born under the influence of globalization. It affects their lives. Neoliberalism, which is a term that most of our people have never heard of, but most of our highly educated Blacks have been educated in, and when you think they're good leaders, they have bought into this, and you don't even know what it is. And neoliberalism is this move coming out of the University of Chicago, an idea that is based on the thinking of the rich. And a few people are giving credit for authoring this, but it's basically their thought. And it is that whatever the government has should be privatized. It should be owned privately. And so you have all this propaganda about big government is bad. You have this propaganda about socialism is no good for you. You know what I mean? Yet in places like Europe, you have free medical care, a national medical system. And that system at least helps people when they go through crisis like this, but also contributes to their longevity and health. But in this country, this is identified as big government. That's Republican propaganda, but the Democrats have bought into it as well. So neoliberalism is a move by big business to grab everything they possibly can that comes from the government. Right now, if they could, they would grab Social Security. That, in fact, the Republicans have already shaped legislation for that. And believe it or not, Trump was the only thing standing between the Republican Party and privatizing Social Security. I pointed this out before. That was how he got elected. He had fake populism, so he promised to protect people's Social Security. He also promised to go against these big trade organizations that I'm going to get into in a minute. But he indicated that had he been elected a second term, he was going to take out Social Security. And he started by, I pointed this out in a previous show, taxing the payroll tax, which funds Social Security. So the hip hop generation, the generation born from the 60s on, is raised up under globalization. And what does this mean? They're raised in an environment where they see nothing but designer clothing, Gucci, and all of this. They're raised up in an environment in which the mass media, which is owned by these same global corporations, is giving them a certain message and a certain image. The hip hop community was greatly affected by the movie Scarface. And many young hip hoppers say that was a defining experience for them. By the way, in my generation, there was the Scarface, and it was James Cagney who starred in it. And he was coming out of the Al Capone era. And I found it to be a scary movie as a kid. But it didn't have an effect on my generation's values because my family was in charge of those values. Now, I got miseducated in the public schools and brainwashed, so I got assimilated. I had to rise up out of it. But basic fundamental values, they were being passed on by the family, the church, and the school, but particularly my parents. They got that through. So Scarface, I wasn't thinking about being no gangster, but my uncle was a numbers runner in Los Angeles and would come up every now and then and give us free silver dollars and had him a nickel-plated pistol. And my father was very angry whenever he saw that nickel-plated pistol. He didn't want to see any guns in the house. My father's weapon of favorite choice was brass knuckles. Brass knuckles didn't get you in jail. Shooting somebody would. Plus, it went against his Southern values. So the youth are being raised in this environment. Boys in the Hood, which is a positive portrayal in that it is portraying what's going on in a community in Los Angeles in which one family has the father in it and other families don't. And it's giving you a message from Singleton, who's just passed on. He was one of our best filmmakers, on what happens when the father ends up missing, which is a post-1968 phenomenon that really hits a Black community since 1980. Boys get out of control. And it's not because all sisters can't handle boys who are becoming men, because some of them can. In the Black community, you have two types of sisters, mothers: those that can handle these boys when they get bigger and those who can't. And those who can, they can be 5'2". And when they shout, people bend down. Shaq O'Neal, when you see his mama come into the studio, he starts going, "Yes, mom." So somebody, I need to talk to his mother and tell her to slap him upside his head for supporting Trump. Tell him, "I know you think you got a good boy there, but straighten him out on that one." I'm not about to. As I said before, he's too big. Plus, I'm never going to see him anyway. So with globalization comes globalized values. And these globalized values affect the worldview of the hip hop generation, the younger generation, in certain ways. While the culture continues to be strong in certain ways, it puts holes in it. And it puts our young people in a position where they're having values put in their head that's competing with the values coming from their parents. And of course, the biggest value is the material value. And it seems to have its greatest influence among the poorest among us, because certainly we want these things and we're entitled to have a better life. Now, so what you see then is they're born up under the younger generation, under the influence of these corporations. They have a positive influence in that you find that hip hop culture gets to be globalized through, the multinational corporations. And you even get a few big business people like Jay-Z coming out of this. We also see that with globalization, you have the emergence of some big athletes making big money, big entertainers making big money. And so this is the positive side of what is largely a negative situation. Now, while globalization for a few is beneficial, for the majority, it brings on impoverishment. Because with the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer mega corporations, like right now you're looking at Jeff Bezos, Amazon, was the richest person in the world. I think it's the second or third richest person in the world right now. He just got sued for not giving his employees their tips. He's stealing their tips. This guy's worth so much money, he could spend the rest of his life counting it and would die before he could count all of it. And so while the glitz has its effect on mindsets and on values, the majority of the people are driven into poverty through this glitz. Data shows that the 6 richest people on the planet have half the Earth's wealth. 6 people. So right now, you're seeing people dying from COVID. That's caused by Trump. That's caused by mismanagement. China's managed it and doing quite well. Their economy is booming, 4% growth. But the fact is that the deaths that have occurred through COVID aren't just due to the mismanagement of people like Trump. It's due to having no healthcare system because the global corporations that control healthcare, insurance companies and others, they don't want a healthcare system because it's profitable to bill you for everything. So that if you end up with a serious illness, I don't care how wealthy you are, you're literally going to be stripped of your wealth. This is a part of this globalized mentality. So since World War II, and in fact, towards the end of World War II, a global order has been set up. These have had an effect on values in Black communities. There was a meeting called the Bretton Woods Agreement, or a meeting that was that occurred outside of New York City towards the end of World War II. This was a meeting convened by the United States. This meeting gave birth to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And Roosevelt himself had given birth to the United Nations. This was part of setting up a global system that would put America in control. Democratic and Republican parties both move, particularly the Democrats, to the corporate model. It used to be a time where labor had an influence in the Democratic Party. Reagan destroys really the base of labor unions in this country. About 12% of workers in this country are in labor unions. It used to be much higher. And with that comes impoverishment, because we now know most people are living on a minimum wage of some $7 an hour, $10 an hour. The fight is now for $15 an hour, which doesn't get you to more than about $28,500 or $600, which has still got you in poverty. So globalization, the breaking of unions, increases impoverishment. And then you have trade organizations or agreements, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, GATT, General Agreement in Tariffs, Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump killed, that was worse than all the others. All of these have brought poverty to the majority of Black and brown people and a growing number of whites. But connected to this is the decision, as a part of this globalized economy, to go to taking the best paying jobs that an average person could work, manufacturing jobs, shipping them out of the country. And so then the impoverishment reaches a high level. So if we want to understand why Black families are weaker now than they were between 1865 and 1968, is just one piece of data. With deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing jobs, Blacks were 20% of those jobs. And so when Black men and women, but largely men, lost those jobs, they lost the capacity to financially support their families. And we'll see that while we had businesses, we'll see what happens to these businesses in a minute, though we still have them, forces hit them as well. And so what we find is that between 1976 and 1982, 700,000 Black men lost their jobs, and exactly 700,000 Black men left the family. So you want to know what's happened that's weakened the Black family. No finance, no romance. You might have romance in the beginning, but sooner or later, you got to pay the rent. sooner or later, you got to be able to put food on the table. So declining marriage rates are directly tied to impoverishment. And so if the average Black person is working at a job that will produce a male or female 20,000 a year, they're not going to marry. The data is clear on that. And by the way, white families are going the same way. But when they deindustrialize, they take jobs out of the Black community, send them to China or Mexico or somewhere else, but also the suburbs. Now, a lot of those suburban jobs are being lost. And Blacks can't get to the suburbs. They usually can't drive, but they ain't going to get the jobs anyway. So these forces are major forces. Globalization, on the one hand, affects values. On the other hand, it affects circumstance, and the circumstance is poverty. It drives people into poverty. And so what we see then is that this is an invisible force, these corporate forces. This isn't the kind of force that you just stand up to like the Klan and shoot at them, or the police and fight back, which, by the way, the police are there to, protect the profits gained by these big entities. These are invisible. They're visible in that you see them on the media, but the way in which they're organized and everything else, generally, most people don't understand that. And it affects the globe. It affects Africans on the continent. It affects Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in Europe, Africans here. Now, in addition to that, we know the powerful external forces that hit Black communities, and these were ones that reoccur, but now they become a little bit more sophisticated. In the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a real attempt to kill off Black leadership that had come back from the Civil War. A brother named Henry Adams, who had fought in the Civil War. He becomes a major leader in the South. He's gone from plantation to plantation, teaching Blacks how to read and write, and then organizing groups to figure out how we can get this terror off our head. And he leads a movement to leave the South to go to Kansas, Pop Singleton and others. These are grassroots leaders. Many are either killed or driven out of the rural areas into urban areas away from their base. So it has been a practice of this country to go after principled leadership. I know they came after me, you know what I mean? And so what we find is one of the powerful external forces that hit Black communities is payback. It's payback for the successes of the Black freedom movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther movement, the Afrocentric movement, the Pan-Africanist movement. It's payback. And so one of the biggest paybacks was the assassination of key Black leaders, and Malcolm, King, Fred Hampton, a host of others, and attempted assassinations of others, and driving others into exile, or some, like Assata Shakur, was fortunate enough to have people in the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground to free her from maximum security confinement, and she now lives in Cuba. I know she'd like to come back and see her family, but there's a bounty on her head, and she'll end up in jail for the rest of her life for something she didn't do. So in killing some of our best leadership, then it's like taking the eyes out of a community, taking some of the best thinking out of the community and setting it back. It doesn't mean that, you've destroyed liberation movements, you set them back. When you took Malcolm out, you took probably our best organizer for this radical tendency in the Black community, best thinker. And with King and Malcolm too, who had become committed to systemic change, which you hear talking about right now, except theirs was more radical. That's the side of King you don't hear about. And by the way, on this show, you've already heard a speech that I gave on King, but I'm going to have on this show a brother named Manu Ampin, who I think has the best analysis on King. If you think you know King, you'll have to hear what he says, to really get a good understanding of this. So assassinations set us back, but it wasn't just assassinating leadership. As I point out in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, the Ford Foundation came up with a strategy, and that's one of the best funded corporations, funded by the profits of Ford Motor Company. The Ford Motor Company, Ford Foundation, comes up with a strategy for creating a new type of leadership. As they're killing off Black leadership that's militant, they are supporting a drive that a lot of Blacks wanted, but in a different form, to promote Blacks in the system as leaders, as mayors, as city councilmen, and other positions. But they, as McGeorge Bundy said when he addressed the Urban League in the mid-60s, said we needed a new leadership that could negotiate a new way for Black people, meaning a way that won't threaten the system, a way that will really not benefit Black people. Blacks wanted mayors, but the mayors who ended up being in office largely had no history of struggle. A few have, a Harold Washington, a few others, but the majority had not. So it was a combination of hammer, where they come down on you, and then a smile, where they seem like they want you in the system, but it is really to sideline you from struggle. Another powerful external force that hit Black communities, and the youth have been affected by it, but the elders as well, is redevelopment. And redevelopment, we called that Negro or Black removal in the 60s, breaking up certain Black communities. A decision was made at a high level in this country that there would be no more Black communities. Well, unfortunately, that hasn't worked, but they have broken up some key Black communities like the Fillmore, which was the basis of struggle for the Black freedom movement in the 60s that I was a part of, or Harlem. And so there's some key Black communities that have been hit. But on the other hand, you see this Black Lives Matter movement emerges out of Ferguson that has over 70% Black community. And the question is, what do we do in communities where we have that kind of numerical power? And we need to be focusing more on how we really build grassroots organization in those communities. So that's a force that hit us, and it was a hard force to resist, to stop, because you have major corporations supporting breaking up communities that had good housing, but they had Black people, and they wanted to disperse us. So what we see then is all of these are heavy forces, but we know next to globalization and deindustrialization, the most devastating force to hit Black communities is the drug traffic and the drug trade. CIA has admitted now that they put drugs in the Black community. Maxine Waters and others, they were holding hearings on this, late 80s, early 90s. And they had to come out and admit, yeah, they were involved in this. This was a destabilization move. This was a move by the intelligence agencies to knock Black communities off so that they could not mount resistance movements. This was intentional. And this same move was made by the British and China when they put opium into China. The difference is China had their own land, but still you had a whole lot of opium addicts around for some time. It took a freedom movement to cut that loose, you know what I mean, to end that. So the drug traffic introduces into the Black community drug values. And those drug values, as we are quite aware of, unleashes a set of values that threatens the values coming out of African-American culture. And they are particularly damaging because with the breakup of Black communities, with the growing impoverishment of this country and of Black people, then what you find yourself in, our people find themselves in, is not having a fallback position. We have Black businesses, we still do, the second largest employer of blacks, of black businesses. 90% are owned by a single person. 40% of those businesses have gone under through COVID. And one of the demands that need to be coming up, and I know that Black Lives Matter and other groups are making them, but your groups, your communities need to be making this, is a substantial amount of money that's going to come through what's going to be Biden's infrastructure project needs to go into black businesses. Big money, because if he doesn't, black's going to turn off on him and there ain't going to be no second term. And I don't think he's going to run, given his age, a second time anyway. You're likely to have a black woman running for president, but she ain't going to have a chance if you don't address some fundamental issues. And that's one. So what you have then is, with globalization, deindustrialization, and drugs hitting the black community, these are heavy, heavy hits. And with it, we have subhuman values and we have violence hitting the black community. And the most serious damage that was done with the drug trade and the drug traffic, aside from all the things that it did to women who get addicted to their families and men, but especially women, because it will take out the maternal instincts when your whole life is based on getting a fix. So that was bad. But one of the worst features of the drug traffic is the wedge that it drove between the young and the old. Because now, with a drug traffic in your community and armed youth, and note, when the drugs were first put in black communities, you had trains in certain black communities just left near the black community full of guns. Guess who left them there? Guess who left them there? It's the same kind of stuff they were doing in Central America. Same kind of stuff that this country was doing in what they called the third world. What you need to understand is our community has had war waged on it. Just as they bombed Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, this was their bombing. This was their bombing. Drugs was a bomb, and drugs killed a whole lot of people. And with the drug traffic, then we have the excuse that the system has for creating the prison industrial system. And that starts with Nixon criminalizing the use of marijuana, which, as long as they could just put it on white people, you know, was just a recreational experience, and continued to be after it was criminalized for blacks. And then what we see is, after that, we have with Reagan, when Reagan comes into office, you have a series of crime bills, and these crime bills, in effect, lead to greater imprisonment of black youth. And so what are some of these crime bills? The ominous crime bill of 1984 under Reagan, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, again, Reagan, Bush 1's Violence Initiative. Clinton goes crazy on it. See, a whole lot of black people hold him up as great. He's one of the worst presidents blacks have ever had. He did end welfare. He did end Glass-Steagall, which was the one protective thing that kept banks under control and really enabled them to now play with your money, of course, with your consent, but you know, you get to invest your savings in the stock market and stuff, and leads to huge amounts of derivatives, which are packages of investments that nobody knows what those investments contain. He brought the economy up slightly, where there was an improvement in terms of jobs and everything else for blacks for a short period of time. But the ending of Glass-Steagall, which was done during the Roosevelt administration, brought the economy down. He did more to bring the economy down than anybody else. And so we see with Clinton, old Billy, he sets up the Law Enforcement Act of 1994. And the Law Enforcement Act of 1994 set aside $10 billion for building prisons. And he goes crazy. So the death penalty for crimes at the federal level linked to Black and Latino youth, such as carjacking and drive-by shootings. Can you imagine? Death penalty for carjacking. I don't know if anybody was ever actually put on death row for that, but Clinton's always apologizing for stuff, but he does some of the worst stuff. So if you think his apology means anything, you need to redefine what apology means. Because when you intentionally do dirt and keep doing dirt, apology, you're not even capable of that. And then we see with all these forces hitting the Black community, and the only jobs available are low-paying jobs. You see the underground economy development, which is based on crime. We see gangs becoming a way of life. Because it used to be that Blacks formed gangs to fight against white gangs, to protect themselves. Then they become little criminal enterprises, but what ends up happening is once Blacks get a good job, they leave the gangs. Latinos the same way. But now when there are no jobs that are viable, you can support a family on or live on, then the gang becomes like a family, a permanent family that you're living in forever, virtually. And so, of course, the biggest gang are the corporations. And they are driving everybody into this position. And of course, now Biden has signed executive order moving to end privately owned prisons, but that's only at the federal level. Privatization of prisons, again, a part of neoliberalism, so that the people who impoverish you, the big corporations, drive you into crime, break up your communities, can now own the jails and even get poor Black and brown and white families to pay for phone calls that cost a huge amount of money so that they can make profit off of just about everything. So the hip hop generation, the generation born after 1960, 1968, and particularly by the 1980s, is born under an environment where prison becomes a part of life for a lot of Black youth. And in fact, prisons become a rites of passage, a very bad rites of passage for manhood. A lot of styles, fashion styles, are being made based on prison, including sagging. Now, in my generation, my mother told me, I don't remember, but I'm sure she told me the truth. We didn't call it sagging, but I was hanging my pants pretty low. And some others were. But when my mother got to me, that stopped. But the key thing is that didn't come out of a prison fashion with all the other implications that that has. So the fact that now a large number of our youth are being incarcerated and the educational system is being used to prepare our youth for jail or for the military or for homelessness is all a part of these powerful forces. So these forces have to affect people's concept of their worldview. It has to affect aspects of their culture, and it has to affect values. And so when I talk about a choice between two cultures, what we're talking about is a qualitative difference in circumstance. And while all Black people are living under this, living under prisons, living under globalization, it's the younger Blacks who are being largely put in prison. And it's the younger Blacks who are being raised in a situation in which families are weaker. And so they're not as able to combat the influences of the media, which is portraying the corporate values that are in some ways inhuman, in other cases, just beyond your reach. And they can lead you to do things that you wouldn't normally do just so that you can have some designer clothes or sneakers, whatever. So these are causes for um, the intrusion of external forces and external values. Now, while we look at these forces and there are many others, the key thing to get straight is that in spite of these external forces, the major features of African American or New African culture continue. And the hip hop generation continues to hold on to some of these key central values in the culture. The youth, and you know, I've had a discussion with some youth on this. Some Black youth will say, well, my generation's not conscious of race, that they're not race conscious. I said, like hell, yes, they are. As long as there's racism, there will be race consciousness. And so the hip hop generation continues this race consciousness, but also race pride. Now, the research of Dr. Wade Nobles and Lawford Goddard on the Black family, it indicates that while there's a value among Black youth of marriage age around Black pride, not as many of them are teaching their children the values of race pride. And that's because the corporatized, globalized influence in their environment leads to a greater emphasis on individualism. One of the biggest shifts between the young and the old is between the values of the group and the individual. In African American culture, you have always had to be a strong person. So you could say a strong individual, and at the same time have a value for the group. But what happens with the intrusion of these external forces, a greater value is placed among too many of the young on the individual over the group. Surveys on this show this, but you don't need surveys. You know this. And African American culture is fundamentally humanistic. But a greater emphasis due to these external forces and due to the impoverishment of our people is placed, at least with a growing sector of young Blacks, on material values over the human. Not to say that they've been dehumanized, but the point is that when they get a choice, those material values become very important. But as we're going to see, that ain't wholly the case, because some changes have occurred in the culture that would indicate that there is still a very strong sense of valuing the human being, a very strong sense. And our mothers and fathers, especially our mothers' teachings, have taken root in many of the younger generation. We see a continuation of African American culture in the use, value for, and emphasis on creativity. The hip hop generation, particularly the initiators of hip hop, placed a great value on creativity, and they did not expect to make money off of this art form. And in fact, hip hop, whether it's rap or aerosol art or breakdance and a host of other things, can be described as urban blues. It is the use expression of the blues, and the blues ain't all sad. What the fundamental thing is about the blues is its beauty. And the fundamental thing about the youth is at a time in which the Bronx were burning in the 70s, where landlords were burning houses because now people didn't have jobs and people couldn't afford to pay rent, so that they collect on, you know, the insurance policies. At that same time, the youth are coming up who are having art in the schools and everything taken out. So they're not learning to play a saxophone, playing drums, and playing a host of other instruments. They go inside themselves and they draw on the principle of the word up. And they begin to use this art form to bring beauty out of ugliness. And of course, now, anytime I talk about hip hop, people will put me down and say, what are you doing that for? Because it's all a mess. They're talking about gangster hip hop. They're talking about the corporatization of hip hop. But there's an underground hip hop that's still there. And there's a message that's there with them. I'm talking about that part. But the key point is that this artistry, the pride and beauty and the necessity of poetry. My good friend Upesi Mtambuzi, she had a saying. She was a poet. She died a few years of cancer, a member of our organization. She said, for Black people, poetry is not a luxury. Poetry is a necessity. Most Black people have got somebody in their family that's a poet. This art form that the youth come up with is poetic to the core. Look at this young lady who did the inaugural poem. That was an in-depth poem. I mean, she said something. I was listening to her. It was long too. And I think that's good. They didn't point out when they interviewed her on CNN, Harvard graduate. You know what I mean? But Harvard graduate with sensibility, because most people coming out of Harvard are useless stuff. But she conscious. She calls herself an activist. Got her on Time magazine. Go on, girl. I said, beautiful, you know? And she had a big old ring on. It didn't fit her because just looking, she didn't look like the type that wore a ring. My wife explained to me that that was a gift from Oprah Winfrey, you know? And it brought out a theme of Maya Angelou, you know, one of her writings. It's like a spiritual mother to her. So this generation prides itself on this creativity, and we're going to see it's manifested in more than just the art form, though. The art form is real key. Hip hop generation, this generation born after the 60s, still has a fundamental value for freedom. And in fact, their art form is an improvisational, innovative art form. And that is what freedom is for us, to be able to create. We define freedom as a creative process. You got to be free from restraints so you can create your own thing, you know, what you were brought here to, you know, to do, to bring out your own gifts. So the hip hop generation continues this. Now, marriage rates are low because on the one hand, marriage ain't exactly affordable for a lot of people. With a number of generations experiencing single parent households and seeing some marriages that come and fall apart, some people have come to have a mistrust for marriage. And so singlehood is another choice between two cultures. It's not one that we want to make. Most Black men and women want to be married. But the fact is, some have come to mistrust the institution of marriage, but they still want families. And so what we see is new family formation. So when you say 28% households, two-parent households, you've got all kinds of relationships. I mean, I hear brother and sister talking about, I'm into a committed relationship. They got all kinds of names for this, but they're sticking with each other because they love each other. And as we pointed out before, even with the declining percentage of Blacks who are married, most of those are Blacks marrying Blacks, which means Blacks like each other, but the hip hop generation got some real issues around male-female relationships, and we know that. And those would have to be real serious when the economics aren't working, and then a lot of craziness is going on in Black communities, and when some sisters, and I don't put this on most sisters, but some sisters find it attractive to be attracted to the bad boy. He's got the glitz, he's supposed to be bad, he's got the ride, he's got this and that. And he's usually got a lot of jail time and a short life expectancy. And that's not true for most sisters, but for some. And that's, again, an intrusion of someone else's values. So this choice between two cultures is especially manifested on a generational level. But what's real key is that when we look at the question of this choice between two cultures and we look at generations, my generation is defined as the civil rights generation or the Black freedom movement generation or the Black Power generation associated with the Black Panthers and with a host of other movements. My generation is defined by its best. All generations are. Yet everyone in the generations not involved in those movements, but have benefited from it, are inspired by it, and in many cases are the basis for it. If the people hadn't rose up in the South, no Black freedom movement. So we can talk about a king, he's a mouthpiece for it. But it's the people that have really made choices. But not all people, all Black people, made the choice to be a part of these movements. So the fact that what we've called the hip hop generation has found a political voice, starting in Ferguson and then working its way up, is a testimony to positive cultural choices that this younger generation has made. And while we call this the Black Lives Matter movement, if we notice the uprising on George Floyd was an uprising that came spontaneously from the grassroots. The masses of Blacks joined by whites, joined by Asians, joined by Latinos, largely young, but not all young, but largely young. That was an upsurge of the grassroots. And what's interesting about this is at a time in which our community's been hit by heavy external forces, the only way you're going to really be able to address this is if we have powerful internal forces that combat that. And it's not going to be any singular leadership that's going to be able to come up with, here's the answer and follow me. The day of the Kings and the Malcolms, they're over. I've been saying this for 25 years. And most of my age group wasn't listening. This younger generation got the message. And so what you see is when you see the uprising and starting in Ferguson, which the most important thing about Ferguson is that people stood by their principles and hung in there and established something. And then some ladies got together and bottled air and called it Black Lives Matter. You know what I mean? That was stating a commitment to humanism, that you can't just go out and wipe us out. We care about each other and we're going to do something about it. And it's sisters saying that. And that is really saying something about the relationship of brothers and sisters. As raggedy as they may be on one level, on the other level, it's reaching a very high point of love, to the point that the youth prepared, and some older ones, but especially the youth, to put their lives on the line to express this principle. So the fact that this generation has found its political voice is a testimony first to the mass of our people, who, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and are tired of the police running into our community and running over us, you know, and are standing up. And so this is a real key thing. Don't forget, though, these movements occur at the same time that violence is still going on in Black communities. When Black Lives Matter movement was going on in Chicago, I get a call from one of my good friends saying, man, these Negroes up here are still shooting each other. What's wrong with them? You understand? Huh? So I'm not saying that, oh, we just wiped the slate clean. No, we still got problems. But the fact is, a large sector of the younger generation has found their voice. One of the things that I think is real key here is that, on the one hand, in the powerful external forces causing a choice between two cultures, we have this problem that a lot of our youth, especially, are put in a difficult position, our elders as well, but especially our youth, of choosing, making the right choice when they think we don't have a culture. How are you going to make the right cultural choice when what you're living every day is your culture, but you've been told you don't have one? You understand? That spoken word thing you went to last night, that's an expression of your African culture, but you don't have one. That protest that you went to, you know, around a police killing, that's an expression of your pride and your race consciousness and your ability to fight. And but you don't have a culture. So young and old, but especially the older generation, bears some responsibility for not having done the in-depth work of examining this culture and pointing out its strengths as well as its weaknesses, but especially its strengths. African American culture is the culture of popular choice of this country and of the world. The world has a better appreciation of how powerful this country is, of this culture is, than most of us inside this country, because they're moved by it. Every aspect of this culture you'll see here, go to Europe and you'll see groups formed on it. The Nation of Islam, they got Nation of Islam chapters. Afrocentrism, they got Afrocentric groups. You hear me? Black Lives Matters all over the place. You hear me? Black Power movement, Black Panthers. They had the Bali Panthers all the way in India, which is or Dalit Panthers. These are the untouchables, the blacks whose country was taken away from them. You got a global culture. Globalization has a culture, but on the one hand, it's the materialistic stuff that is beamed through television and commercials. The art form of America, as Gore Vidal pointed out, pretty good historian. He said, America, and he's talking about white people, their only art form is commercials. I mean, if you're watching a movie, these movies, I watch Netflix to relax my brain. It takes me 2 hours to find a movie because it's all crap. You know what I mean? But, you know, if you're watching a show and you see a commercial, it's funny, but it ain't no art form. Give me a break. They're selling a product. They just put all their energy into that product because money, honey. You know what I mean? So our youth have been put in a position where they need to understand that to talk about hip hop as a culture is a misnomer. Hip hop's an art form. It's an art form of this younger generation, which is their urban blues. But the culture is the depths from which that art form grows. At its highest level, it's its highest expression. Jazz is a highest form in the African American art form. And that's why the classical art form of the United States is the classical art form of the world. It's founded on the blues, the spiritual blues. Go watch my segment on the spiritual blues, baby. That's a beautiful piece there because the blues is beautiful. You hear me? And our youth have this desire to recreate beauty. And I don't think there's nothing more beautiful than the Black woman. You hear me? And the Black woman who's conscious, some of these sisters you seeing right now, who are standing up on the line, all sizes, fat, skinny, all colors, putting that sassiness right into the police's face. And there's one picture of a sister standing up against a whole bunch of National Guardsmen, standing up erect as bad as, I said, go on, sister. You hear me? Huh. Don't be talking, when I talk about a choice between two cultures, don't misread what I'm saying. I'm saying some holes have developed. There's forces that have caused it, but this culture's got deep roots, and the roots are in the souls of Black folks. You hear me? And no matter how bad things get, we get tougher. I don't care what the situation is, we're suited to handle it. And as my great teacher, Professor Ray Richardson, taught me, I've said this before, I don't repeat myself too much, but this one, she said, as messed up as we are, we ain't as messed up as they are, and we're smarter. So in case you think I'm just romanticizing this, no, but I'm saying the muddy water is beautiful. That's Muddy Waters, the blues musician, but it's muddy water, that's the culture. You hear me? And mud has got water, and that water is nourishing. It's funky. You hear me? It's soulful. It's down home. So we see then that it was hard for our families and our communities and extended family communities to resist these forces of globalization, deindustrialization, these material values, and of course the violent values of a drug culture, but particularly those first two, because we were wired for racism. We were not wired for how do you handle something global. I mean, most nations have trouble with that one, you know? So these were hard to resist. But because our culture is grounded in our people, we still see that we're coming forward and coming up with something that provides an alternative. Now, when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement and compare it to the Black Freedom, Black Power movement, sometimes called the Civil Rights Movement, Black Panther movement, the anti-war movement that we gave birth to. We were the first to really oppose the war in Vietnam. Compare this, because when a generation finds its voice, it finds it most importantly through the liberation movements that are, as Cabral said, expressions of culture. And at their highest points, the expressions of the highest levels of culture. Not all liberation movements are expressing high culture. So it depends on the movement. Malcolm manifested highest level of the culture. King did as well. Neither one were materialistic. King got the Nobel Prize, put it into the movement. Malcolm took a very small salary from the Nation of Islam, lived in a little small house, and didn't even put the mortgage in his family's name, which was his mistake. He should have. But the thing is, they thought about the people before money. And this Black Lives Matter movement, I think we can say safely that they're placing a higher value on the people. Though there's some funding that they've received. I don't know how much, but it's probably substantial. But the fact is they put their necks on the line. Now, when we look at measures of success, look at this. The Black Freedom Movement achieved the phenomenal success of defeating Southern style apartheid on the grounds of legal segregation, defeating that legally. It's, you know, they're still doing their number. And in the level of the right to vote. Those were big victories. That really stomped down the first post-Reconstruction. What does the Black Lives Matter generation achieve? They put forward a mass movement that hit 50 cities and 50 countries on mass scale. They shifted public opinion, which I pointed out before, isolating Trump into a narrow corner. He still held on to his Republican base of white people, mainly. He was the white president and brought in 4 million more in this election. But his strength was his weakness. His strength was white people. His weakness was it was restricted to white people with a few blacks, a few brown. And of course, whites were divided, a majority on his side. But when Black Lives Matter hit the street and the picture of George Floyd being stepped to death, Breonna Taylor murdered, and a host of others, they stood on this humanistic principle and isolated him. And that isolation, along with the mobilization, as I pointed out in the last presentation, brought out a huge vote that knocked him out of office. So in part, the grassroots in general, Black Lives Matter in particular, can say they have scored a victory for their generation. And that victory is doing in a psychopathic, racist, fascist inclined, ill-informed president. And you didn't just do this for Blacks, you did it for humanity, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it doesn't mean you have a saint in the White House right now, and it doesn't mean you go to sleep. The pressure has to be put there. So that is a singular achievement, but it is saying something about that generation, that while there are values, and in this particular case, the individualistic corporate values that have hit the youth, and it's still there, but there is a higher set of values coming out of the movements that this generation has put forward. Also, and this is, and I'm going to wrap up on this one, our culture's been hit hard, holes in the culture. We're in a position where we have to choose between two cultures. But the power of the culture moves us. And what this Black Lives Matter movement says is a generation of young people, and not so young now, some of them in their 50s, some won't tell me their age, who were leaders of this. They've come to maturity, they have found their voice, but in so doing, I don't know if all of them are conscious of this, but they can certainly see it from the results of their actions. They have demonstrated that this culture still has the ability to create chain reactions. When we move, Asians move, Latinos move, white youth move, even some white elders move, and the world moves. And we don't have an army. We don't have the kind of global economy. We don't have the media power that the corporations have. Yet what is blared through the media that is most appealing is coming from us. Sometimes distorted stuff, but often with a message. So I want to say, as I wrap this up, this is an era of the choice between two cultures. Make no mistake about it. Whatever we do as a people is going to have a cultural component tied to the politics, a cultural component tied to economics. Obviously, a cultural component that is the basis for us defending whatever we have. A cultural component that defines and shapes and strengthens our families. What I really want to say is that the awakening process in this has to be deepened. It's good to have movements that can produce change, demonstrations and stuff like that. We have to do the hard work in our communities of rebuilding and revitalizing our communities. But the hardest work is freeing our minds. And freeing our minds is going into the depths of our souls and coughing up those negative values, some of which are leftovers of slavery. Those of us who still have self-doubt about our own issues or our own abilities, or lingering senses of we're not as good as someone else, lingering expressions of the inferiority complex. Those of us who still have color complexes and a host of other complexes. Those of us who have taken on these alien values that come from globalization and these materialistic, inhuman values. We have to do internal work on that. This shows about that, but this is work that we have to be doing in our communities. There are community groups around the country dealing with that, and they're not necessarily Black Lives Matter. And these are jobs that we have to do. We have the job of rebuilding an economic base in our community, and really supporting that base. And this is one that I will be getting into sometime later. We need to look at the model that our families operate on. What's the model? We have a model coming out of Africa. My book, Return to the African Mother Principle, Male and Female Equality, is the only study in the world that accurately defines that. That comes from God. And then I did my homework. I redefined what African families are based on. And my research shows that Black families that are in good shape, that is, good relationships between husband and wife, they're going to have issues, problems, whatever. They're generally following this model. It's just that we're not theoretical, so we're not going to be putting a label on it. We didn't go back in our history and figure this out and then come up with this. This was basic to what we thought would work best. It's coming out of the culture. And so models have to be revisited, models for the family. And those models are fundamental for carrying us forward in the future. Because in the end, we're preparing for creating just societies. Long-term. Short-term, building power and institutions in our community sustained by some Black consciousness that's deep. Deep in love, deep in respect, deep in self-knowledge. I hope you get it from me. This comes from my heart. I put a lot of time into this. I haven't written in 4 months because I've been preparing for this show. I'm figuring out my format so I can get back into writing, because writing is the most important thing I do, because that's something I'm leaving for posterity. Everything we do on this show is designed to leave you something that will be worthwhile generations from now. So I'm not putting out anything that I think is garbage or anything off the seat of my pants or asserting something that I can't back up. And if I'm incorrect on something, call me on it and I'll work on it. I don't have all the answers. I don't claim to. So regard each of these shows as chapters in a book. And I've been going through the analytics that is provided by YouTube. And it's interesting that I've got quite a few of you who watch for quite a while. And then I'm figuring out that a lot of you go back and watch more. And some of you only tune in for a minute, but I'm not a 1 minute man. Sisters don't like 1 minute lovers, you know what I mean? But I ain't got no 1 minute message. I mean, I wouldn't be wasting my time on this if I did, So I'm doing my best to present to you what you can use in your life. And I would appreciate from you if you let me know what else you want and what you think of what's being presented. I'm enjoying every minute of this, and I enjoy the interaction. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm enjoying this a whole lot. I would appreciate it if you encourage people to subscribe. Go get your friends to watch this, because on YouTube, subscription defines a whole lot. They have algorithms on here. I can't even put anything on the bottom of my show that gives the logo, the address and stuff until I got 1,000 subscribers, And it's in my interest. I want to get as many as possible. I'm on other people's shows to get them to come to this show. I'm on Pan-African DTV. It's a sister out of Germany, Sister Tata, very conscious, beautiful sister. Check that out. I'll probably bring that show and put it on my show so you can click into it, but check it out. Sonetter, who's got over 100,000 followers, Brother James Smalls, was nice enough to hook me up with both of those shows. And he's conscious. I was on there maybe 2 months ago. And I'm doing that so that I can bring in more viewers, because I'm doing this so that I can impact a larger audience of Black folks to encourage you to use your own powers to strengthen yourself, strengthen your identity, and strengthen your communities, strengthen your people. So I just say Hotep, and I'll see if there's any comments up here. I see one. Robin Hughes. Hello, Dr. Tashaka. Thank you for that explanation of hip hop as an art form born out of our cultures. I agree. I often hear people say that hip hop is a culture. Yeah, good point. I think it's interesting, though, that a lot of hip hoppers created a total package. So they thought, a package of the rapper, uh, the turntable artist, the aerosol artist, they prefer that to graffiti, the breakdancer. You know what I mean? So that's a total package. But what's interesting is that most of your real creative hip hoppers will tell you, I was listening to some that you might not hold in the highest regard. Snoop Doggy Dogg, he was saying, before I do my stuff, I listen to me some rhythm and blues, indicating that there's something else he's drawn from, the roots. And we know Public Enemy, you know, those are among the most conscious of the hip hoppers, the rappers. Um, Chuck D, his mother came out of Black Panther Party, you know. So there's a direct linkage there. So hip hop is an extension of the culture. It's a new expression. It's strange, more strange to the ears of somebody in my generation because they don't hear that blues idiom all the time, though some of the hip hoppers have it. But it's their expression given their circumstances for trying to address the conditions today, the positive ones. Now, the negative ones that have been taken off, the little Waynes, who call himself Monster Wayne. Of course, he can say what you want. Trump gave me a free pass, baby. I get it. I don't expect you to send that back. But get smart enough so your little black behind doesn't have to be going to jail because you're packing a gun. First of all, that's probably worth somebody's house. And secondly, ain't needed. Can't you hire some legal security? And you probably don't know how to shoot anywhere. You know what I mean? And probably would shoot the wrong person. So, there's the negative side. We're aware of that. And by the way, every art form that we produced has positive and negative. It ain't all been good. You know what I mean? But basically, it's our highest expression. This is from Stephen McKenzie. Dr. Tashaka, I saw you on both platforms. Great job. Thank you. And he's also in an earlier message, Black Power. And this is from Joyner Hampton. Thank you. Love you, Dr. Tashaka. We are all greater because of you, Ashe. I'm greater because of you. I owe my stuff to my people. And without my people, I don't know if you heard my little thing that I did on King. I had a little term. I was speaking to 4,000 Black people. I said, I'd have been a pinstripe wearing, briefcase carrying, remote control, 00 soul Negro. I might not have been, but probably I was headed on that path. I had some people tell me, oh, it's good you're on our side, meaning I'd have been a dangerous Negro. I hope not. My mother said I wouldn't be because she put some pretty good values in us. So did my father. My father didn't fight in no wars. And once I woke up, I realized I've been wasting my time in the ROTC and the Marines, but I don't regret that. That's where I was then. Own your stuff. I didn't kill nobody. Fortunately, y'all woke me up before I'd be given that choice of Vietnam or jail. Been going to jail for my people. I hope I had enough sense not to go to Vietnam because Ho Chi Minh is, a brother, our brother. We woke him up at first. He woke us up secondly. Garvey got to him first. We got to Garvey before Garvey got to him. And then Garvey and him got to us. Black man in Vietnam. What you doing here killing a yellow man when you go back to America and you're going to be living in a segregated neighborhood? It was a brother who was a captain in the Marine Corps intelligence who heard that in a foxhole in Vietnam. And when he went back to Chicago, he couldn't buy a house in a white neighborhood. And then that's when he got the message. So Uncle Ho woke a whole lot of us up. You know what I mean? Oh, I see right here, Stephen McKenzie says you are training new leaders or have a course on organization or have a course on organization. Yeah, that's a good, I'm glad you pointed that out. I have a program, leadership training program, called P.A.P.O, which is the highest university system in ancient Kemet, which meant house of life. That's the highest university system in the world. They only taught Kemites, a very few non-Kemites. So it's called P.A.P.O, House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. And I've been training people in leadership. Yes, this show is part of it, but I have systematic training that I want to go into. In fact, I have this little binder here, which has the Aztec calendar on it. It contains curriculum and stuff. And I've trained some young people in this, but I'll be doing a lot more. But this show, I want to do that at certain times for specific leadership training, but it can't go like this. I have to have people who are in the community on the ground doing work. You know what I mean? If other people want to go and be entertained, fine, but I got to have people who are doing work. And then we exchange. I was talking to a young brother in Baltimore yesterday who's doing great work in his community. Various organizations around the country doing good work. And so it'll be an intergenerational collaboration, but a way to deepen our skills. So that's something that I want to do. So yeah, this is contributing to that, but there's a deeper thing I want to get into. And that's also tied to the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which some groups missed in the 60s. And more than anything, it accounts for their demise, because if you're raggedy on the inside, you're going to be a mess on the outside. And when the system comes to mess you up and you're already messed up, hey, it's field day. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I want to get into. But it'll be something where I have to build a following on this channel, and I have to really reach out to people who are doing work already, or some who want to learn how to do work, but are committed to applying that to their communities. So I see that's it. I don't see any other comments. I just want you to know I love this, enjoy it, love all of you, and hit the subscriber button. Get some of your friends in. By the way, I only got 2 people that pulled out of their subscription, and and it was on the last show. And I figure ain't no Black person pulling out on that analysis, which was on how we led the defeat of Trump. I figure I know who did that. And I mean, if that's what my message does, that's the only time somebody pulled back a subscription, fine with me, because it means I hit home. You know what I mean? If you're upset by being told that we outfoxed the dummy, you know what I mean? Imagine how you're going to feel when you figure out how we've outfoxed some foxes. You know what I mean? Some real smart people, because he had some smart people behind him and he wasn't listening to him. So I would much rather beat smarty than dummy. But if you are causing hell, we're going to whip your butt. We don't care what your gray matter is, because you're hurting humanity. So thank you, Hotep. It's been a pleasure. And I'll see you next week. Haven't figured out what the topic will be, but you'll get it in a short time. Thank you.